Hi everyone, welcome to the second video for chapter 1. In this video, we're going to talk about the investigation and some important pieces that go into the investigation. So the first thing to think about is the mindset, the critical thinking and professional skepticism that individuals need to have when they're working on the investigation. So individuals who commit fraud look exactly like us. We already have talked about that, how it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly what a fraudster looks like. So if the typical fraudster has no distinguishing outward characteristics to identify themselves, how are we supposed to approach an engagement to detect fraud? And it can be really challenging for a fraud investigation because we have to look beyond our own value system. So we have to think like a fraudster. So we want to use professional skepticism in order to make sure that we are operating with due care and able to have that mindset that we need in order to determine if a fraud could be present. So what that means, there's kind of 3 elements here. So first, we have to recognize that fraud may be present. We have to always kind of have our nose thinking about it, having an attitude that's questioning everything that we're given and making sure that the answers are adding up. So first, having that recognition that the fraud might be present. Second is we have to have a commitment to persuasive evidence. So I guess that's third. So the attitude is second. The commitment to persuasive evidence means that we're committed to having an evidence-based structure and that we are willing to pull on those loose ends. So a knitted blanket might unravel, but we might be able to get to it at the end if we pull on those loose threads, if we want to see what happens to unravel the fraud. So red flags. So red flags is the term that we use when we think about a loose thread or something that doesn't quite look right. It comes back, it's a warning signal. It comes back from the days when there were pirate ships and they would run the red flag. So red flag is a warning signal. And it's what professionals are looking for, such as anomalies or unexpected relationships that tell us that there's something that could be going wrong or something that requires a little bit more investigation. So other words that we might use is symptoms of fraud or badges of fraud. These are other synonyms for red flags where something just doesn't quite look right. So here we have listed quite a few different red flags or things that could give us a symptom of fraud. So unexplained accounting anomalies. So maybe our sales are going up, but our cost of goods sold are remaining constant. So maybe there's an internal control weakness that could lead to some fraud. Some analytical anomalies. When we look at when we do some analytical analysis, things just don't seem to look the way that they should. The non-financial data doesn't correlate with the financial data. So something non-financial that we know about the organization isn't lining up with what their finances are saying. Maybe an observation of an extravagant lifestyle. So someone makes $50,000 a year but drives a Porsche. That might be an example of something that would cause some concern. Unusual behavior, oversleeping, never taking a vacation. Those are some other items that could bring up some red flags. So risk factors can typically or will fall within one of 3 categories. So first we have motivational. So we have some risk that giving us additional motivation. So an example here is management is focused on short-term results. So they are really pushing you to meet your numbers this quarter. Situational, there's ample opportunities. We don't have great internal controls. Or behavioral, the company culture has a high degree of tolerance of risk, and just the culture in the company might lead you to think that there could be something going on. So the next is to talk about this evidence-based decision making. So evidence is the basis for our we're thinking about this from a legal perspective. So in order to get a jury to believe you, we have to have evidence-based decision making. So following the issues of critical thinking and professional skepticism, and having that commitment to evidence-based decision making. One of the best ways to ruin an investigation is to fail to have good evidence and to follow logic or conjecture, and maybe the bad person theory. So this guy is just a bad guy, and he's done all these bad things in his life, so of course he must have done this fraud, but we don't have any evidence to support that he's done this fraud. So we have to make sure that our investigation is grounded in evidence. So what is evidence? So evidence is anything perceivable by the five senses. So anything you can see, taste, hear, touch, smell, that is considered evidence. Any proof, such as testimony of witnesses, records, documents, that is, that's typically what we think about as our evidence. Anything that was presented at the trial to prove contention and induce a belief in the mind of the juror. So that is what we call evidence. So when we are thinking about evidence and this evidence-based decision-making, we are trying to identify who, what, where, when, and possibly why, if we can have evidence to support it, of our case. So as we are going through the evidence, we are trying to answer those questions. So successful investigators base their conclusions of who, what, where, when, how, and why based solely on the investigation and the evidence that they have gotten through that investigation. The problem of intent. So intent is why we're doing things. So the why piece, that's the part that can be difficult to have evidence to support. So while the fraud triangle provides an effective explanation for the conditions necessary for the fraud to occur and is a source for those red flags, in order to prove a fraud, the investigator has to deal with this problem of intent. So intent, like all aspects of the investigation, must be grounded in evidence. In a fraud case, the challenge is that short of a confession by a co-conspirator or the perpetrator, evidence of intent tends to be circumstantial. There's this other fraud. So we have another triangle. So we have the fraud triangle, and then we have the elements of fraud, which is another triangle. So the elements of fraud include concealment, conversion, and the elements of the fraud. So by being able to prove the elements of fraud, we sometimes can use that to show intent. So if the investigator has evidence that the alleged perpetrator committed the act, benefited from the act, concealed his or her activities, it becomes more difficult for the accused to argue that they didn't intend to cause harm or injury. So proving that intent is crucial to these fraud cases. So again, those three, how we can prove intent is to prove the fraud. So we have the act. How was the fraud perpetrated? Second, we would have the concealment. How did they hide the act or mask it to make it look like something else, or like it didn't happen? And then finally, conversion. How did that benefit the perpetrator? So to solve that problem of intent, we have to prove the elements of the fraud in the second fraud triangle, the elements of fraud. So as we are going through this and we want to have evidence-based decision making, we're going to use something called the hypothesis evidence matrix. And there's a picture of this in your textbook. I took it out of the slides. But essentially what we want to do is, as we are going through the steps, we want to continually think about what we think is going on and does the evidence support that hypothesis. So as the investigator is going through this, they're going to have maybe some competing hypotheses. So this could have happened or that could have happened. And then as they get new data and new evidence, which of these hypotheses is supported with that evidence? So we're going to go through this approach kind of in this order. So first, we're going to start by analyzing available data. And then we're going to create the hypotheses. So based on the data we have, what do we think could have happened? Then we're going to test the hypotheses to see if one might come out on top of the other, refine and amend the hypotheses based on those tests. And then finally, we can draw the conclusions. Essential investigative tools. So essentially, two tools here regarding the nature of the fraud examination or the financial forensic engagement. First, the fraud examiner must be skilled in the examination of financial statements, books and records, supporting documents. So we have to have those technical skills to be able to know what we're looking at. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is the interview. So interviewing individuals is a process, it's a skill that we use to obtain relevant information about the matter from those that we're interviewing. So these are the two essential investigative tools that we will utilize throughout the investigation. Here we have evidence gathering information. So this looks like a little bullseye. So in a fraud examination, evidence is generally gathered from the general to the specific. So we kind of start at the outside of the bullseye, the general, and then work our way in toward the center. And this is for fraud examination. We'll look at fraudulent financial statements in a second. That's going to be a little bit different. So this rule applies when we're gathering our documents, looking at the evidence and taking witness statements. So a fraud examiner would start by interviewing neutral third-party witnesses first, people who may have some knowledge about the fraud, but are not really involved in the offense. And then they would interview maybe some corroborative witnesses, people who are not directly involved in the offense, but who may have some additional information about the offense. And then after we interview the neutral third parties and the corroborative witnesses, if it appears that further investigation is warranted, then the fraud examiner would interview suspected co-conspirators in the alleged offenses. These people are generally interviewed in order, starting with those who are thought to be the least culpable all the way up to the most culpable. After all of those interviews have been conducted, then we would interview that target. So we kind of are working our way in both by the evidence that we're gathering as well as the interviews that we conduct. Now, when we are thinking about fraudulent financial statements and tax returns, we're actually going to go in the opposite direction. The investigator is going to start with a suspected perpetrator. The logic here is simple. So when we are having fraudulent financial statements or tax returns, the person basically thinks that they're smarter than the auditors and the investigators, and they won't get caught. So they're kind of banking or betting that their intellect is above the fraud investigator and they're not going to get caught. So essentially, we would interview that person at the beginning of the audit to document their claim that the financial statements are not materially misstated, or that the tax return is properly reflected. And then as the auditor finds fraudulent financial information, they've caught that perpetrator in a lie and have developed the evidence that they would need for concealment. We also are going to rely on some non-financial data as we are going through the investigation. So this is any data from outside of the financial reporting system. So this could come from inside the organization, but it's not necessarily part of the financial reporting system, or it could come from outside of the organization. So let me give you an example. So let's say a husband and wife are getting divorced, and the husband owns a bunch of restaurants, and he is stating that they only have $50,000 of annual income from these businesses. However, the husband and wife both drove expensive cars. They sent their children to private schools. The husband buys significant amounts of real estate, and all of that is not supported on $50,000 of annual income. So how could the wife prove that he is misstating that income? Well, one way would be to get the local beer distributor records, so to subpoena the records of the local beer distributor. And those records would detail exactly how much beer and the type of beer, whether it's kegs or bottles or cans, were sold to that restaurant during the prior 2 or 5 years, however far back you want to investigate. And then the forensic accountant could go to the restaurant and look up all the prices of the beer and calculate out exactly how much profit they should be generating from the beer that they have purchased. So doing that, instead of showing that you only had $50,000 worth of annual income, you find out you have $500,000 worth of annual income, and the wife is in a much better position in her divorce. So that's one way that we could use some non-financial information. Graphical tools. So it is imperative when you are providing reports to clients in these sorts of engagements that you provide clear communication of your results. And an easy way to do that is through graphical tools. So a linkage shows who knows who. So it shows links between various people or organizations, so we can see those connections. If we wanted to know who is connected with what business, or how does a scheme work, then a flow diagram might be a better graphical tool. And then finally, what are the important events can be shown on a timeline. So during the investigation, these tools, these graphical tools, can provide important clues and enhance the investigator's understanding of the facts and events to help us interpreting the evidence and draw some meaningful conclusions between data that looks like it may not have any relation. So they can also help to show weaknesses in our case and places where additional evidence is required. So if we don't see a link between the data, we might say, oh, there's a weakness here and we need to do some additional digging here. So these graphical tools can be used throughout the engagement to help us identify those holes, draw those conclusions, and then finally to be able to communicate them with the client. So we have the importance of storytelling with the investigation. So we're going through this process, we're gathering evidence, and we're trying to basically answer the questions: who, what, where, when, why, and possibly how. So for each of these questions, we need to find evidence to support it and be able to tell a full story to whoever has hired us. So attorneys or juries or judges, whoever it may be. So we have to become expert storytellers. So the outcome of our investigation essentially is who, what, where, when, why, and how. So investigations that are centered on the elements of fraud, so the act, concealment, and conversion, and include indicators of the fraud triangle. So the opportunities, mice, money, ideology, ego, those things that we had talked about, those have the greatest chance of being successful because they show that the investigation was grounded in evidence. And then finally, a big part of an investigation is working together as a team. Thinking like a fraudster is challenging, and investigative teams can be an effective tool. So the team can help with brainstorming and interpreting the meaning of evidence, helping to develop new theories, and just working to connect the dot. So in order to be a good teammate, two things are important. First, competence, and the second is character. So competence means that you are contributing to your group, you have high quality ideas, you have high quality written work, and you can you get it done. So that's competence. You have the skills needed to get it done. The second is character. So what type of teammate are you? Do you attend meetings? Are you available to your teammates? Are you doing your fair share of the work? Are you listening to other teammates' ideas? So just like being a good team member in class, we want to continue those skills. That's part of the reason we do group projects, is to build those teamwork skills. And leadership, both by the person who is designated as our leader, as well as the teammates demonstrating leadership when their unique abilities are needed by the team, is also important to the investigation. So that concludes this video. I hope you got something out of it. I have one more for you on fraud examination. So be on the lookout for that in the to come. Have a great day.